Hi, I just got a message that he's just lost electricity, so he'll be joining us in around 2 to 3 minutes, I guess, if it's fine.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm sorry, I just lost my electricity. It's raining quite heavily over here. Could you just give me a minute before I start?
Yeah, it's fine.
Thank you. Cool, let me just set my timer. All right. Yeah, I hope I'm audible. Good. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Go. I understand the metric of regret for this debate, right? We don't think we can have this debate from multiple perspectives in terms of whether we regret it in terms of USA, whether we regret it in terms of Israel or things like that. We think the most vulnerable actor in this debate is Palestine, and we should view this debate from that perspective, in the sense that whether this deal really benefits Palestinians or not, and that is the way this debate should move forward. We think the opening half has been quite shallow in terms of understanding the sort of policies or the sort of politics within these regions, right? First of all, you see OG just talking about the idea that, you know what, Palestinians are getting screwed over for so long, but we don't understand anything with regards to incentives for UAE and Bahrain, what is going to happen in the Middle Eastern bloc in terms of whether Saudi is also going to join into these things, what are the impacts of those things in terms of how it will benefit Palestinians later on. Nothing like that, right? Moreover, OO's only issue is that, you know what, Hamas is bad, and somehow through this deal, you know, things are just going to be okay. People get jobs. There won't be any sort of radicalization, which we think is complete BS, right? Couple of small things to rebut against OOO. Seems to think that, you know what, Hamas is just like how it was before, where they wanted absolute destruction of the Israeli territory. We don't think that's true. In 2017, they did change their charter and they went ahead and opted for just having Palestinian regions within the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, right? They don't want to go ahead and completely destroy Israel and change that charter. Moreover, they've improved relations also with the PLO in 2017, where they want to go ahead and form those moderate things. There were wars before that, but these things did not work out, where you had a separation of powers in terms of the West Bank owned by the PLO and Gaza by Hamas, right? We think they have gone ahead and done these things where they become more moderate. Moreover, PLO has become far more moderate, especially since 2014, where the leaders of PLO themselves are against intifadas, etc., and they want to get some sort of moderate change, right? We think these sort of things that are important, that really pushes out of this debate, where they come and unfairly characterize the state of Palestine today, right? So a couple of things we need to talk about. First of all, what is this deal and why did this happen in the first place, right? We think it's quite problematic, because understand, this deal is necessarily to normalize relationships between the Arab states and Israel, right? The problem is the normalization of this relation with Israel means the normalization of the ignorance of the problems that Palestinians are going to face. Because look at what UAE did right now. UAE said that, you know what, we are so happy because we suspended the further annexation of Palestinians, except we get nothing from the UAE ministers telling whether these things are going to be stopped later on. For how long are we going to suspend these things? Nothing of that sort. They're using these things just to go ahead and shirk off their burden, because they want certain benefits. benefits. What are these benefits, right? First of all, you get F-35 fighter jets right from USA, which means it gives you get, by virtue of getting the F-35 fighter jets from USA, because Trump brokered this deal and promised to give UAE and Bahrain these jets. We think at that point of time, they get that sort of military push over others in the region that is going to benefit UAE and Bahrain. Secondly, you also, by virtue of getting this relationship with Israel, they're going to get they're going to get the Iron Dome that has been recently built by Israel for defense, right? These sort of things that are in the self-interest of UAE. So if you want to view this debate from what is beneficial for UAE, sure, give that win to opposition, but we don't think that is really the debate, right? The debate is about whether it's going to go ahead and push Palestinians in a certain way. We think the interests of the Arab nations right now are still with going against Iran, and we think that is a problem. In the counterfactual, we think there is still a check mechanism placed on the Arab states to go and support Palestine. Why? In 1992, Saudi Arabia went ahead and created the pact where all the Arab nations would significantly go ahead and call out Israel in terms of the sort of action they're doing against Palestine, in terms of the sort of expansion into their areas and all the sort of settlement that they're going ahead and barging into, right? We think at that point of time it's extremely problematic. Moreover, it's extremely bad because understand Israel right now, Netanyahu is facing a good amount of opposition from the other parties which are more moderate towards Palestinians. But the problem is, and right now this is a problem that he's facing, right? 18% of the economy is down. You have 18% unemployment in Israel. You are going into a second lockdown in Israel because of the coronavirus crisis, and he's also on trial for corruption charges. We think at this point of time it's extremely crucial for him to go ahead and make sure that they get that sort of, he can tout this foreign policy achievement, because now, he's getting like the sort of support from the Arab nations in the first place, which means the ability for the opposition now to also go ahead and topple Netanyahu is far less, which means the ability, the potential for that moderate sort of policy with Palestine as well becomes worse off, right? It is something that is important to ignore, something that is regrettable in this stance, right? Which means at the end of the day, when you go ahead and show that it's escape, Netanyahu can escape from these things, it's far, far worse for the Palestinians. Next, in terms of what is the other problem, right? We think it sets a precedence now for other Arab nations to want to be a part of this deal. Oman recently went ahead and commended this deal. Saudi Arabia as well are not really commending this deal right now, because they were the brokers of the 1992 Act, where they went ahead, where they said that all Arab nations should continuously dismiss Israel and call them out for the problems with Palestine. But they also know that there are benefits by virtue of going ahead and teaming up with the US and Israel, which is why they go ahead and test these things right now, right? What do I mean? The Imam right now in Mecca just recently went ahead and said, you know what, it's bad, anti-Semitism is bad. We should also support that Jews should go ahead and be respected, which has gotten a lot of backlash from Hamas and Palestinian groups, where they said, you know what, it's so bad that you used to go ahead and preach that Al-Aqsa Mosque should be respected, and it's so regrettable what Israel is doing in Jerusalem, but now you're slowly shifting your stance. You have TV shows and media going ahead and supporting, regretting anti-Semitism within Saudi Arabia. You have the previous foreign minister visiting Auschwitz and all those things, which means they themselves are slowly trying to softly push the narrative within Saudi Arabia to normalize the relationships with Israel, which means in the long term, we are not claiming in the short term they're going to agree, but in the long term, it is surely going to happen through the slow normalization of this thing within their country, by softly going ahead and making people normal to the idea of relations with Israel. The problem is at the point at which you have Saudi going ahead and joining them, it means have a full block against Iran, right? Now all these Arab nations can be like, hey, you know what? We are joining Israel as long as, why? Because it's fair enough, because all of us are against Iran, who is a big problem. The problem is this: Iran will never back down. Iran will still go ahead and push for Hamas. They will still go ahead and fund Hamas to ensure that Hamas will always go ahead and radicalize themselves in these areas, will radicalize against Israel, and will try to go ahead and wage wars. The problem is this: Israel obviously has to protect themselves. The IDF has to go ahead and wage wars back against the Hamas, right? The problem is this: the point at which you have this sort of normalization of this deal right now, all the Arab nations will also support Israel in their battle against Hamas, which means the impact of this is that the civilians in Palestine are going to get screwed over by this, because you're going to increase the sort of wars that are there. But the counterfactual is that things are getting more moderate right now, where people are getting better. The Hamas themselves are going ahead and wanting more moderate pushes in terms of policies. You have the PLO themselves wanting to major deals with Israel, right? When you go ahead and radicalize these things, we think at that point of time it's extremely problematic, because now UAE and Bahrain and the Saudi and the Arab nation will be okay with going ahead and funding the IDF to go and bomb Palestinian regions and the Gaza Strip and West Bank, because they can still use the justification that we are going against Iran, but we are sorry that the problem is happening to Palestinians, which means they still have a clear justification to screw those Palestinians over, which means here's the comparative. in a counterfactual, where things are getting better in terms of moderate policies, etc., where we have a strong opposition towards Netanyahu, where we have a potential to get moderate policies and a better livelihood for Palestinians, we think that is a better world to live in. In their world, the potential goes away completely because Netanyahu can use this to flaunt his foreign policy changes. We get Arab nations also going ahead and justifying war by virtue of going against their main enemy, that is Iran. Very proud to propose this debate.
Okay, thank you for that. Member Vop?
I'm audible?
Yep.
All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Boy, did I learn a lot about my country today. So, our extension is basically going to be why, under the likelier scenario, we are creating a precedence for the first time of a right-wing leader doing peace with an Arab nation in Israel, why it is extremely important to improve our treatment of Palestinians in Judea and Samaria. But before that, a lot of rebuttal. Firstly, to the entire premise of government bench that with the absence of this, obviously we would have a two-state solution. Several reasons why it's not likely. First reason, Netanyahu is going to stay the prime minister. How do we know this to be the case? A, it has been the case for 11 years straight. He's been elected 4 times in a row only this year. Unfortunate. Secondly, the fact that he has literally no opposition. The leader of opposition, Gantz, just recently joined the coalition. There's no one to replace him. And thirdly, the fact that there is a huge majority of right-wing voters in Israel due to historical and religious reasons, and lastly, because it is impossible for left-wing parties in Israel to start a coalition, because in order to do that, they would need to join the Arab parties, which is literally a political suicide in Israel, meaning that it makes it completely impossible to actually replace Netanyahu in the upcoming time, especially given the current situation of a pandemic, when it is so easy to excuse and say we need to stay in a united front and not make a change of regime right now when we need to stay so strong with the pandemic. So, secondly, we think that in order for any chance...
Hadar, do you mind stopping your speech, please? Atul just lost his connection. He isn't able to hear you at all. I'm so sorry. It just started raining a lot out here in Bangalore.
Sure.
Could we just take 2 minutes? I'm so sorry for this.
No worries. Would you mind if I just, since it was short, restart my speech when he comes back? Because it's hard for me to continue.
Yeah, that would be great because he just told me that he couldn't hear anything. So if you could restart everything.
I'm sorry, guys. I'm back. Yeah, I'm just using my mobile data now. Hopefully it doesn't go down. Yeah, I'm so sorry. You can restart.
So, should I move on from where I stopped or should I restart?
It's up to you. I think from us, it's up to you. So,
you're inaudible. You're muted. Sera.
Sorry, Hadar. Yeah, I stopped you at your 1 minute and 42 second mark. And within 2 minutes, it's okay for you to restart or continue. It's up to you.
I'd rather restart then.
Okay, cool. Is the other team that just got caught up, are you guys stable now?
Yeah. Atul, is it fine?
Yeah.
Can you hear properly?
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much and sorry for the inconvenience.
Okay, no problem. Sorry for the inconvenience, Hadar. It would be great if you could restart.
Cool. 3, 2, 1, go. Yeah, so our extension is going to be why we're going to create a precedence for peace and why this leads to better treatment in the short term, even if peace is not going to happen eventually. However, before that, a lot of rebuttal to the government bench. So firstly, to be clear, yeah, it might be a political stunt for Netanyahu to become more popular. He doesn't need it, right? At the point at which he already has a super majority currently, the point at which he was 11 years in a row the prime minister, there's a huge generation just didn't know any alternative. No one knows what is a different prime minister who is just recently voting in Israel. Thirdly, the fact that there is no alternative because Gantz, the leader of opposition, just joined the coalition. And lastly, because in order to actually form a coalition and get a majority of left wing, you need to go together with the Arab parties, which is A, a political suicide according to Israeli Jews, but B, something that the Arab parties themselves won't agree to because they don't acknowledge the existence of Israel, so they refuse to sit in a coalition. For all those reasons, it is extremely unlikely for a left-wing government to get to rule soon. Secondly, note that there are objective difficulties to actually creating peace, right? A, the fact that you already have 1 million settlers in the West Bank that are Jewish. You would need to evacuate them them to do so. Yes, you can offer them an alternative housing inside Israel, but they just refuse to leave insofar as they oppose the peace. Secondly, the fact that peace in the past not only failed, like OO said, but actually has a memory in the Israeli people of being actively harmful, because so many people still remember the detachment from Gaza Strip, which led to the Intifada, which led to literally kids dying on buses, and people have terrible imagery of that. People are so used to, when we have used to actually try and offer them peace, they've only become stronger. This led to Hamas taking rule in the Gaza Strip. This led to them just getting more and more power, etc. Meaning that if there's any chance of any sort of improvement in the area, it can only be if you make the Israelis believe in themselves, believe really that there is a partner, to actually make them opt into that in the first place, rather than try to force it externally, because it's a bit hard to force externally the evacuation of 1 million unwilling citizens to actually move, right? And we think that this becomes even more the case when CG concedes that Israel on the power disparity is much stronger than the PLO, meaning that it is likely to not be clamoured down into being forced into peace if it doesn't want to. What do we think we change under our side? Several things. Firstly, there is a precedent now of a right-wing leader to actually sign on a peace agreement. What have so far been associated with the left, and therefore no right-wing leader was willing to do, now was done by a right-wing prime minister, and therefore it gets much less criticism than any other agreement suggested by a left-wing party, just because of simple partisanship of people not wanting to oppose this. And obviously it was a very politically favorable action, because the left-wing also didn't want to oppose this, so it is likely to be a precedent of something that the right-wing parties see, we might want to do this again because we didn't get an opposition from our own voters, neither did we get an opposition from left-wing voters. Secondly, the fact that there's a precedent for a peace that actually have led to good results, because unlike in the past, it hasn't led to an intifada or to any direct harm. It has led to economical growth, as government bench concedes. Thirdly, the fact that it has led to just postponement of the extension of the settlements in the West Bank, because it wasn't politically advisable for Netanyahu to continue the settlements as he wanted to, if he wanted this agreement sealed. Fourthly, because now there is also a precedent, which is literally a first time in Israel, of an Arab country accepting us as a country, under the name of Israel, etc., which is super important to many Israeli voters, because the main thing they used to say if they wouldn't agree to the two-state solution, etc., because this would lead to them not compromise on just giving them some of the land. They would want to completely annihilate us because they would never accept us. And this is important because, note, most Israelis don't really differentiate between the Emirates or Bahrain and the Palestinians. There are several reasons for this. First, like just blatant racism. At the point at which you were actively encouraged by your government to be racist throughout years of education because it was the incentive of the right-wing rulers. Secondly, when in her history we are so used to the PLO getting assistance from other Arab states, including the United Emirates during the War of Independence, because they needed all the help they can get because they couldn't have their own military. So we see them as the same conjoined thing. We see them as something that acts together. It is likely that they infer, if we have good peace with them, we can have good peace also with the Palestinians. They make this direct connection because now they see that this has actually worked and this is a similar thing in their mindset. But lastly, we think that it might actually lead to Hamas themselves to actually be more likely to even go back on some of their demands and be more willing to agree to peace, simply because now they get less support. Because as I've said before, they can't win any war or survive any war on their own, because they don't have an independent military, because they don't have a state. In every past war, they used the help of Arab nations around them. At the point at which we have now a huge Arab bloc that is together with us, they know that they also have to compromise many things, meaning several things. Firstly, it means that on the short term, we are at least less likely to make things worse. Even without peace whatsoever, it means less likelihood of doing things such as a blockade that makes them literally starve, less likely to shut down their electricity, less likely to have police brutality like we so often have there, because we now have somewhat more trust and less suspicion of them going against us because we see a successful peace. Before I move on, nothing. Okay, cool. Moving on. But secondly, I want you to note this is definitely not an I thing. We agree with OO when they said, and I quote, on the counterfactual, a two-state solution would never happen. This we agree with. However, in the motion, under the world in which we do have this agreement, it is more likely that in the long term, because right-wing politicians have seen this to be paying off, because Israelis have seen this to work, we have more likelihood of people actually believing that there is a partner for peace. Lastly, we think that even if you don't buy any of that, just directly, there is a huge benefit to Israel being economically more prosperous, as government bench concedes, for the Palestinians. The reason for this is that currently the PLO is economically dependent on Israel because of the blockade, because they can't have their own independent trade and import, because Israel doesn't trust them to not import weapons, meaning that we have the ability to do things such as shut down their electricity or the welfare, etc. And we are much more likely to do this when we are ourselves poor. It is extremely hard to justify to your people why, when there is an economic crisis, they need to pay for the enemy having something to eat, right? Which is exactly why, since the beginning of this pandemic, Israel has increased its economic sanctions on the PLO, which is likely to now get more lenient and improve the situations of the PLO. Beg you to oppose.
Okay, thank you for that. And to close the Gov bench, Gov Whip.
I'll just begin in a moment. Yeah, I'll just start. Give me a minute. I'm just starting my timer. The main problem is not the two-state policy. Even if the two-state policy is destined to fail, that still doesn't justify the current deal that we've got that completely ignores the needs of the Palestinians. We think that this deal has been happening as a manifestation of a bunch of perverse incentives that Daniel talks to you about, like selling arms to these Arab nations and all of these things, where there's a bloc formation going on against Iran. So first, I'll directly respond to CO, and then I'll deal with the opening opposition, and then I'll show you why we are taking this debate. So on the first idea we hear is that Netanyahu is anyway inevitably going to be in power. We think that right now Netanyahu is under huge pressure like never before with the coronavirus and with a lot of unemployment and corruption charges. We think that he's being put under a lot of pressure. Even if him retaining power is a foregone conclusion, which we don't think it is. It's still fine to have more opposition against him, and this deal necessarily stops that opposition. He's less likely to get any check mechanism against the kind of atrocities that he commits or kind of dictates in terms of his policy. So we think in the instance in which this takes away from the opposition that Netanyahu is going to get, we still think it's regrettable. The second idea is that the right-wing leaders signing this peace deal is somewhat of a benchmark precedent. We think there's really no value in this precedent because of the nature of the deal itself. The nature of the deal itself is something that presumes that we can achieve peace in the Middle East without having to deal with Palestine whatsoever. We can completely leave them out as stakeholders and try to strike deals and go ahead and do this. This is the kind of same rhetoric that right-wingers have, that we don't need to care about Palestine. We just have to take their land and strike some deals. So we think in the instance in which this setting some precedent, it's setting the same precedent that has been enshrined already. We don't think it's anything new in status quo that's happening. We don't think that this, even if there's going to be some takeaway, this deal is extremely tokenistic to the degree to which it deals with Palestinians, and that's the way it's going to be construed. Next, they say that Israel now doesn't differentiate between Arabs and things like that. We think at a government level, they still do differentiate between Palestinians and other Arab nations differently because of the entrenched beliefs and continued perception of Palestinians as the same as Hamas and the same as terrorist groups. We think this distinction exists within these populace, and we don't think that's going away because of this peace deal. We think that this is only existing to the degree to which it specifically applies to these other nations and not going to universally extend to all Arabs, because we just simply don't think that's the perception of Arabs over there. Next, in terms of Israel having to compromise with Arab nations, we don't think this again is likely, and this is unresponsive to what Daniel has said. We think that things like no blockades or no police brutality is already something that is being achieved, given that the Palestinians were becoming more and more moderate. But once Iran begins to fund, and Iran's reaction to this, as Daniel characterized, is likely to be more violent. Once these insurgencies get funded, once it gets more support, and given that Saudi Arabia is also bringing it to normalize these things, that these things are totally fine or these things are somewhat acceptable, we don't think there's going to be any large change that happens within these regions necessarily. We think that Israel doesn't have to compromise with these Arab nations, because these Arab nations are going to justify this as anything to do against Iran or anything to do, because that's the ongoing conflict that they really care about, which is why they are holding any stake in this deal. So we don't think the incentives of these people they're going to suddenly start caring about Palestinians, because if that were true, then Saudi Arabia would not be doing what it's doing, which is shifting its stance on the whole issue itself. We think that this whole deal is problematic, and what are the consequences that Daniel tells you? I'll explain that to you again and then compare it with what opening opposition has brought to you. We think that this sets the precedence that nobody needs to deal with Palestine to achieve peace in the Middle East. And we think, given that the Palestinians are the most oppressive stakeholder within this region, it's extremely problematic, because we prefer a world in which this deal did not even occur, or there was no deal whatsoever, than acknowledging a deal or legitimizing the notion that we don't need to consider what Palestinians want, or we don't need to care about what's in the interest of Palestinians to achieve the peace in the Middle East. Given that these are the people whose only bargaining chip is violence, is extremely problematic further. Secondly, in terms of the consequences, in terms of Iran's response, Iran has already vowed vengeance, saying that they're going to take revenge for Soleimani. This increased militancy or block formation with things like technology sharing that happens is going to lead to things like counter block formation with nations like Turkey that escalates tensions, right? All neighboring nations, look, if Bahrain has weapons and all of these guys have these fighter jets, we think the level of paranoia within Iran is going to escalate, or is going to reflect, or going to necessarily have some sort of backlash towards the current deal that has been taken. We think you're likely to see more proxy fundings or of more problematic groups within these regions, and more Palestinian militancy. We think that is when this becomes more justified for for Israel to go ahead and oppress these people far more, with the legitimacy of the Arab nations having sided with you. We think that's completely problematic. Secondly, comparing the case with what opening has brought to us, opening opposition. We think that them saying that Hamas gets checked because there's some sort of employment opportunities that exist, or jobs come in, and with this oil and stuff, there's going to be some hedging against what Iran can do, right? We think the people who join Hamas don't do so because of economic needs. We think it's more likely to do with ethnic needs and the kind of violence that they've been subjected to. That is, they have direct family members who are linked with Israel brutality. They have lost relatives to these sort of things, and therefore they're radicalized. Showing them that Israel is making deals about our land without having any of our say, without us, and they're all getting fighter jets to go ahead and try to oppress you, is far more better ammunition for these guys to go ahead and radicalize these people within these regions. We think that Iran necessarily has an incentive now to cause more instability in these regions to get some sort of fair say for Palestinians, given that this deal is demonstration that nobody cares really about what the Palestinians want, and the whole world wants to move ahead and achieve a peace in the Middle East without really caring about the Palestinians as a stakeholder. We think that this necessarily gives no other choice to Palestinians or to Iran necessarily than to do things like counter-insurgency within these regions, or insurgency within these regions, to get some sort of bargaining chip back. This takes away from the counterfactual that Daniel characterized to you. That is, to some degree, we are seeing a lot of moderatism that exists within these people, and there is some semblance of hope of which there can be some other solution that is reached, even if the two-state solution is taking too long, or because the Jews in the Strip can't be displaced. It still doesn't legitimize the fact that you're going to ignore this oppression, morally speaking, and we think that's still a valid metric of regret. Before I continue, if there's any POI, please go ahead.
Yeah. So even if we were somehow not to associate the literal military that fought along Hamas with Hamas, we think that just the fact that there is a precedence for peace being bipartisan, when so far only the left wing supported it, is in itself A, an incentive for right wing politicians to consider peace in the future, and B, an incentive for voters to think that they don't have to be traitors and left wingers if they support peace.
We think that the perception of this deal is not that peace is being achieved, but rather there's some sort of that they have moved on from Palestine, and they're trying to get a larger peace in the Middle East that has nothing to do with Palestine. That is the presumption or the notion or perception of this is that we don't have to deal with Palestine, and Palestine is not a stakeholder in the way in which we achieve peace. It's only about normalizing relations between Israel and someone else, Israel and the other Arab nations. We don't think that this, even if this deal did exist and people thought it's normal to have peace with other Arab nations, we don't think that this translates into direct benefits to to having peace with Palestine, because the level of indoctrination that has happened to that degree is far, far more. And we think this leads to problems when there's more insurgency that happens in these regions, where Arab nations themselves are legitimizing that we don't need to care about Palestine, which is fundamentally problematic. This again goes back to the characterization Daniel gives you, that this is a stepping stone, or this is a precedent that being set for other nations, Arab nations, to also follow. That is, Oman is coming around and going to sign this. Saudi Arabia is also eventually going to sign this necessarily. So all of this necessarily legitimizes the fact that Israel doesn't have to care about Palestinians, and we don't think that there's any translative benefit that CO is claiming. Extremely proud to propose.
Okay, thank you for that. And to close this entire house, Upwit.
Okay, give me a second. Can you hear me? Okay, cool. Three, two, one. Opening government present unrealistic and unproven counterfactual. Opening opposition present the benefits which are not directly linked to the deal, and also their explanation and characterization, what is included in a deal and what is exclusive, was quite limited. The main metric from closing government was Palestinians, but they never explained how they increased their functioning on their side of the house versus our extension directly clash with them, and show how you make the actions of Israel less reckless, especially when you are codependent, and also how you change the perception internally and not rely on external partners or supporters of the deal, which was not engaged. So I will start from rebuilding almost untouchable extension from Hadar. So firstly, I think what she did is take down the main positive case from Prop Bench, which their positive case, it's two-state solution is mutually exclusive because you gave some kind of moral normalization and you didn't listen what Palestinians are doing. I think firstly, because we analyzed in terms of how the politics in Israel looks like, but also how in the region, the perception of the leaders, what are the likely options, but also how the partners externally and what people expecting from the right-wing politicians and how they are demolished by the other countries in the region. I think this is much better rebuttal and much direct analysis than opening opposition, just saying how that will not work. But second of all, and more important, we told you why the solution which they try to achieve, it's very hard to make by this mechanism, right? By pointing out how the people who are living in the West Bank are functioning, how the deal failed in the past, and by showing how the people involving in creating the peaceful deal in the future have the wrong perception, which is also much more stronger than the international committee, which it's unclear for us how US or Europe or even Emirates were effective in the past. But thirdly, and more important, I think the extension which they never responded at all from closing government is the precedent of the right-wing leader and how you are giving the people the hope or like the positive view on the normalization of the relations with the Arab states or with the Arab nations, right? Because the main problem is they don't recognize us, they didn't give us any respect, and we didn't see how we can still being the nation and why we can still be proud country and having the deals with other Arab nations in the Middle East. That's the signal which saying, look, even if we can't cover all of the problems, even if we can't make all the things perfectly, the economic cooperation by themselves and by signaling this, it's meaning that for the long term you will be combined and connected with your market and with your trade deals. If you're connected with the other countries in your region and with that strong connection, if you gave a lot of prosperity, that means that you can't lose risking that, right? Because your opponents have much more stronger incentive to attack you, because any loss in the deal is directly linked to their economy and to their problems. Therefore, we are saying for the long term, you are much more likely to control the Israel reckless behavior towards Palestinians and stop them from taking down, as Hadar pointed out, taking electricity in the West Bank or attacking them, because they know that retaliation will happen based on the cooperation and all of this. But thirdly, in terms of what's again? Okay, I think someone was unmuted, but fine. So thirdly, and I think lastly, in terms of short-term and economic deal for Palestinians, this is directly clashing in response to the metric brought by closing governments, right? Because closing governments say, the Palestinian perspective is the most important one in this debate. They never analyze how they are making that better or why that's correct. Fine, but we will show you that in the long term, you can decrease the chance of atrocities to happen for Palestinians, but also the economic codependence, and gave them some more rights on our side of the house. So let's deal now what's happened in terms of Trump and Netanyahu from the opening government very quickly. I think it's unlikely that they will prove to us that that will be tipping point for Trump to still become the president, right? I think it's a many factors how voters making their decision. But taking them at their best, they are regretting the deal happening now before the elections. So at best, their positive material, it's some kind of speculations, but also they never analyze how bad is Trump on the comparative, but also why we should care the most in this particular debate. In terms of Netanyahu, I think Hadar perfectly responded. So let's chat a bit about opening opposition. I think they spent way too much time to talking about Iran, right? Because the delta and the change which they're providing in this debate, it's quite small. We agree that probably it's fair to say that Iran is problematic for Israel, but that's the status quo, right? Both United Emirates and Israel perceive Iran as a threat and as an enemy, so they are still cooperating to not let them get the weapons, but also to not get them more power. Therefore, it's unclear how much change is directly coming from this deal. Second of all, a lot of their material rely on false premise that the deal including some kind of autonomy and some kind of selling lands, which is also CG case. That's factually incorrect. But even if it is, it's unclear as well what is the change or like their benefit in this debate in terms of degree of cooperation. But thirdly and most important way with opening opposition, I think it's about the change, because all of their arguments applying to international perception or other countries. But before that, CG, go quickly.
The deal brokered right now only asked for a suspension of the annexation in Palestine, not even a permanent stop for this thing. Why do you think they will have enough bargaining chip to ever stop these things permanently?
Yeah, so the problem is that's not our burden in this debate. That's the first thing, because you never prove how you are doing that on your side of the house and why this is mutually exclusive with the deal. But second of all, I think the economic leverage, when you can bond the countries, but also when you can give them perception that they can still have a deal and being safe and being recognized by other countries, it's much better mechanism to achieve the change which you are trying to make on our side of the house. So lastly, the last weighing with opening opposition. I think a lot of their change rely on the actions from Europe, US, or like other countries externally. I think Hadar analysis basically shows you how you can change the perception of people inside of the countries, which have much more direct impact on their leader, and also what kind of voting and what kind of politics in the Middle East will happen between countries involved, and not only about the outsiders, which from the many years didn't bring the direct impact. Therefore, we are proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you very much for that debate, debaters, despite some technical glitches in the middle. Please exit the room, and then after we're done with the verdict, we'll go out and let you know to come back to the room. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, BRAC B, could you please exit the room? And Nikita, are you here? No, it's fine. Don't worry about it. Are you the Orcon? Okay, cool. Yeah, I don't mind. Also, just one thing. Is the oral education being like filmed, like streamed? For okay. All right. All right, good. All right, so welcome back. This is how my OA is going to go. First, I'm going to give out some general impressions about the debate. And second, I'm going to give out the verdict. And third, I'm going to give out the justification for the verdict. Actually, I'm going to go over the feedback and, just impressions part at the end of the OA, just because we're, under some limitation of time. So we took a bit of time because we arrived at initially pretty different rankings. So we took a bit of time trying to reach a consensus among those rankings. And now, the three of us all feel quite comfortable with the rankings that we arrived at. So the rankings are as follows. We thought that this was a closing half debate. We gave the first to closing opposition, second to closing government, third to opening opposition, and unfortunately fourth to opening government. So what I'm going to do is compare from fourth to first and compare why each team got the rankings that they did. So coming from opening government, I think as much as opening government does a good job initially outlining why, this is a moral harm and how this is not a deal that is actually doing justice to the Palestinian people or whatnot, we felt that as both sides coming from opposition did point out, opening government lacked analysis on why their other alternative, which is a two-state solution, as moral and ideal as it sounds or is still a probable alternative. I think, therefore, what Oji was saying about how, this the two-state solution being sidelined, being a harm, ended up not becoming too significant of a harm after being engaged with both sides coming from opposition. So even though we felt that this point about, although we felt that this initial point about the two-state solution was important because opening government continually talks about why it's so detrimental that Palestine being exploited in this political deal is bad. When opening opposition and op bench in general, as a matter of fact, talks about how the two-state solution is essentially quite impossible to achieve, and why at least on opposition side, although the ideal is suboptimal, why there can be still some actualization of benefits or protection for the Palestinians. We felt that in that comparison of the benefits or protections that can be guaranteed to the Palestinians alone, we felt that the comparative was a little bit tilting more towards the opposition bench as a whole. So even the point about how, the morality of the case coming from OG was fair, but I think opening opposition did a fairly good job pushing back on how there can be different standards or metrics of morality and how the ones that have been set by OG are quite arbitrary. And OO does a good job reframing what constitutes morality in terms of what brings the most strategic value, therefore reduces the loss of life for the Palestinians and whatnot. So I felt that coming from the op bench as a whole, and as well as opening opposition, there was quite good pushbacks coming from, there were quite good pushbacks against the opening government's case. And unfortunately, we felt that there was no evolution of the case after that, engaging with the opening opposition. So I felt that unfortunately, opening government took fourth in this debate. So the reason why opening opposition gets third in comparison to opening government is, as I said earlier about that engagement or pushback against opening government that was good. And in addition to that, what opening opposition also does is to provide us with analysis as to why and how the two-state solution will actually not work. And what they use here is, based on historical trajectory or the fact that Jared Kushner is currently in power and things like that. So in comparison, I think OO does a better job compared to OG in terms of why the two-state solution is probably not going to work. And therefore, we were convinced that it would probably be not a fair comparison for OG to continuously use the two-state solution as a viable alternative. But still, in comparison to the closing half, why does the opening opposition fall out or lose out? We felt that there were two things. The first one is that although opening opposition's points about how this curbs Iran through cooperation was good, the problem with that is that eventually the debate evolved into focusing more on the metric of Palestinians' lives and Palestinian protection and livelihood or whatnot. And I think this was a metric that was quite clearly set up coming from closing government and fairly well accepted in hindsight by all teams as well. And what this necessarily meant was that even if the benefit coming from OO about Iran being curbed or whatnot was good, the magnitude or the value of that impact ended up not being as big as intended at the end of the day. And I think CO also does point out how Iran being a threat to Israel and other Arab countries is a status quo harm, and how the benefit that we can achieve coming from OO is marginal at best. So in that sense, even if we did give credit to that benefit, the size of that benefit ended up becoming not so enough to overturn the closing half at the end of the day. And also, another large bulk coming from opening opposition was on how Palestinians right now are being brainwashed by Hamas or whatnot, and how that's a big problem. But I think, again, CG does a good job of pushing back and rebutting by their recharacterization of how there are moderations happening within the Hamas forces and whatnot, and therefore that also knocked out the likelihood of the harm coming from OO being very true. So in comparison to that, CG does a comparatively better job in terms of filling the loopholes that have been left off coming from the opening. And what do we mean by that? I think CG provides us with the mechanisms or more context as to why the two-state solution can still be considered to be on the table. And the things that CG brings in is things like how there is growing opposition of moderate forces against Netanyahu, and how there are moderation efforts of Hamas as well. I think these are very important contexts that are able to differentiate coming from the opening government and prove to us why the two-state solution can still happen or may still happen, and why jeopardizing that is such a big harm. And in addition to that, CG also does a good job on talking about why making this peace deal sets a bad precedent of making a deal without Palestine and whatnot. However, when we compare this with closing opposition, we think that closing opposition, in terms of proving the likelihood of whether two-state solution is going to happen or not, we felt that CO provides more internal dynamics as to why and how Netanyahu will more likely be elected into power. And we appreciated that because we felt that it was a lot more complex and nuanced, not just understanding, these politics in terms of external eyes, but also in terms of the internal dynamics and sentiments of the people that have a direct effect or influence on whether Netanyahu will be, elected or not, and whether he will still have the momentum to execute his, hard wing or hard right policies or whatnot. So we appreciated that kind of more, we appreciated that dissected analysis on what the people and on what the people's sentiments are, and how that also interacts with, the political power of Netanyahu and whatnot. But more importantly, I think what CO does well is their ability to break down the core premise of government that the two-state solution is still a valid alternative. And the way that they did it was by the whole internal dynamics that I said before. And I think by doing that, CO was able to further strengthen why this agreement is therefore the unique chance, or why this is an exclusive opportunity and things like that. So it also strengthened the unique validity of this agreement. Some of the comments that came from the panels in terms of weighing between CG and CO was this idea that CO's engagement or rebuttals against CG on Palestinian lives being saved or Palestinian lives being lost was not as direct as it could have been. But what we deduced from this was that given the mechanisms and the case that CO was able to give us, we felt quite comfortable with being convinced that if the people in Israel are able to have hope on peace deals with Arab nations, and how that translates to trust towards having peace deals with Palestine as well, how that creates enough momentum for peace deals in the future to potentially actualize. And we thought that this was important because that's a piece of analysis that was not proven until the end of the debate, whether in the long run, if two-state solutions or any kind of mechanism that allows that to happen can be possible or whatnot. And I felt that the indirect linkage coming from CO was able to prove that. And if that were true, that also indirectly engages with CG's case about what about the lives of the Palestinians, or how do the benefits drill down or trickle down to the people on the ground. So we felt, although we definitely would have appreciated more if CO could have more directly linked this to a direct engagement with CG, we thought it was quite sufficient for us to be able to buy that. And lastly, I think what CO also does is push back CG's metric on the Palestinian life with their own metric of how we can better contain and de-radicalize the actions of Israel. And we also felt that that metric setting was important in terms of proving to us why Palestinians' lives are indirectly associated with that metric that was given out. And in engagement to that, I think although closing government does a good job of pointing out the bad things that are going to happen on the opposition bench, CG at the same time simultaneously doesn't prove on their side why things are going to be better off on their world, whereas CO is comparatively able to do that better. So that's how we basically saw the debate, but we had quite interesting discussions and initially different rankings. So please feel free to approach any of my panels for their wonderful feedback as well. So thank you for that, and we wish you the best of luck for your future rounds. Okay, cool.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Where can we approach you for feedback?
Hi, please approach me either through Discord or Facebook. Discord would probably be a little bit more accessible, but yeah.
Cool. Thanks.